You ever wonder what the most expensive mistake in history was? I'm not talking about a lost treasure ship or some disastrous stock market crash. No, the most expensive mistake in history was a laugh. Just a single, arrogant laugh from one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. He was given a number so huge, so utterly ridiculous to him that he just dismissed it as a joke. But here's the thing. That one little joke, that one laugh, it kicked up a chain of events that would end up burying his entire empire under a literal mountain of steel and aluminum. So let's get into this, because this is the story of how that laugh became the most expensive and the most deadly joke ever told.
And this quote, this is where it all begins. It's 1940, and Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, the big boss of the Luftwaffe, the most feared air force on the planet, he gets this intelligence report. It says that the American president, FDR, is telling his country they need to build 50,000 airplanes a year. Now, you have to understand who Göring was. He saw himself as this grand, almost artistic figure, the father of modern air power. To him, building a fighter plane or a bomber wasn't just manufacturing. It was a craft, an art form, something that required the discipline and martial spirit that he believed only a nation like Nazi Germany possessed. And Americans, in his mind, they were just, well, car salesmen, jazz musicians, a decadent society totally incapable of the kind of focus needed for total war. So when he hears this number, 50,000, he doesn't see a threat, he sees desperation. He sees a pathetic bluff. And that belief, that deep, unshakable arrogance, was the single biggest miscalculation of the entire war.
So let's really break down why Göring and the rest of the Nazi high command felt so smug, so absolutely sure of themselves, and why they were so catastrophically wrong. It all starts with a challenge that, if you just look at the numbers on paper, seems completely and utterly impossible.
Okay, now I want you to just take a second and really look at these numbers. The audacity here is just staggering. In 1939, the year the war starts in Europe, the entire American aircraft industry produces a little over 3,600 planes. For everything, the Army, the Navy, civilian use, all of it. Roosevelt then goes to Congress and asks for 50,000 a year. That's not an increase, that's a 14-fold jump. It's like asking a corner bakery to suddenly start supplying bread for an entire country overnight. And you know what? Göring wasn't the only one who thought it was crazy. A lot of people in America thought it was pure fantasy. At that time, the U.S. Army had barely 1,700 combat planes, and most of them were already obsolete. So here's the real question. Why did the Nazis see this as a delusional joke, while Roosevelt saw it as a target you could actually hit? The answer tells you everything you need to know about the two sides.
The answer is right here. It's a phenomenon we can call ideological blindness. See, the Nazi regime wasn't just a government. It was a cult built on a fantasy of racial superiority. And the most dangerous thing about it? They actually believed their own propaganda. They had good intelligence officers on the ground. There was a German general in Washington, a man named Friedrich von Bedecker, who was sending frantic reports back to Berlin. He was warning them, saying things like, American war production will reach unimaginable heights. He was telling them the truth, but his reports were just ignored, buried, because they didn't fit the narrative. When Bedecker tried to warn Hitler face-to-face, Hitler reportedly flew into a rage, screaming that America was a half-Judenized, half-nigrified nation, a mixed-race society that was, in his view, weak, disorganized, and totally incapable of fighting a real war. They chose to believe their racial theories over their own intelligence. Think about that. It wasn't just prejudice. It was a conscious, strategic decision to be blind to the facts.
And while Berlin was laughing, something incredible was happening across the Atlantic. That so-called decadent, mongrel nation, it started to wake up. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt called it, was coming to life, and it was going to be run by a man who knew a thing or two about making a whole lot of cars.
And this is the guy, William Knudsen. He was a Danish immigrant who had literally worked his way up from the factory floor to become the president of General Motors. He was the world's leading expert on mass production. So when Roosevelt needed someone to turn his impossible dream into a reality, he asked his advisors, and the answer that came back was, first Bill Knudsen, second Bill Knudsen, third Bill Knudsen. So Knudsen leaves his job, a job that paid him $300,000 a year, which was an astronomical fortune back then, to go work for the government for $1 a year. He was the living, breathing embodiment of everything Göring and Hitler underestimated about America. He was the genius who knew you could apply the principles of an assembly line to even the most complicated machines of war.
So you have the architect, but who's actually going to build all this stuff? Well, this chart here shows one of the biggest, fastest social changes in American history.
In 1941, women made up less than 1% of the entire workforce in the aircraft industry. It was basically a non-existent number. Just 2 years later, by 1943, they made up 65%. Two-thirds of the people building America's warplanes were women. And of course, what did Nazi intelligence do when they saw this? They reported it back to Berlin as a sign of weakness, a sign of desperation. They literally couldn't wrap their minds around the idea that mobilizing your entire population, men and women, freely and voluntarily, wasn't a weakness, it was an absolutely monumental strength.
And let's be clear, this wasn't just about having bodies to fill jobs. This was about incredible skill and dedication. And this quote, this just perfectly illustrates that point. This is the actual record of a woman named Rose Will-Monroe. She's the real person who inspired the famous Rosie the Riveter posters. Working at the massive Willow Run bomber factory, she was driving 3,000 rivets in a single shift with nearly perfect accuracy. These were not just amateurs filling in. They were becoming masters of their craft. In fact, at another aircraft plant, after they brought in women inspectors, the rate of defects on finished planes actually dropped from over 3% to just 0.3%. They weren't just a replacement workforce, they were a competitive advantage, an advantage that the Nazi ideology was completely incapable of seeing, let alone understanding.
But it wasn't a smooth ride, not at all. And the story of this one factory, Willow Run, tells the whole story. This place was supposed to be the crown jewel of American production, the largest factory under a single roof anywhere in the world. And at first, it was an absolute unmitigated disaster. The very first B-24 bomber that rolled off its massive assembly line was so badly built, it had to be completely taken apart and rebuilt. The press had a field day, mockingly calling the plant, "Will it run?" But this is where the American system showed its true strength. They didn't hide the failure, they didn't execute the managers, they learned, they adapted, they broke down the plane's 500,000 parts into smaller, more manageable sections, they invented new tools on the fly, they completely redesigned the workflow. And just look at that turnaround. In about a year and a half, it goes from a national embarrassment to a production miracle, pumping out 428 heavy bombers in a single month.
And this right here, this is the moment everything changes. This is where the trickle of production becomes a tidal wave, where the laughter in Berlin finally gets stuck in their throats. This is the moment American industry achieves something that, to this day, just seems to defy belief.
63 minutes. Let that number sink in. At its absolute peak, the Willow Run factory, that one single factory that started as a joke, was finishing a brand new 4-engine B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes, around the clock, 7 days a week. Just think about that. A machine with hundreds of thousands of parts, designed to fly thousands of miles and drop tons of bombs, was rolling off an assembly line faster than you can watch a movie. One factory in Michigan was outproducing the entire German aviation industry combined. This wasn't just manufacturing anymore. This was a weapon of war in itself, a relentless, unstoppable force of production that was grinding the Third Reich into dust.
And what did this industrial tsunami actually look like from the other side? For the German fighter pilots who had to fly up and face it, the reality of these numbers was a living nightmare. This quote is from Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's top flying aces, a true hero of the Reich. And he's describing what it was like to fly in 1944. The sky was literally black with enemy planes, from horizon to horizon. His words capture that soul-crushing despair, the feeling of facing an enemy that you simply cannot beat, no matter how good you are. His despair wasn't because the Allied pilots were better. It was because they were, for all practical purposes, infinite. They were an endless stream flowing from a factory thousands of miles away.
And this chart, this gives you the cold, hard math behind that feeling of hopelessness. By 1944, a single American daylight bombing raid could have 1,200 heavy bombers, escorted by 900 long-range fighters. That's over 2,000 planes in a single mission. And what could the once unstoppable Luftwaffe send up to stop them? Maybe 200 fighters on a good day. Imagine being one of those 200 pilots, looking up and seeing an aerial armada 10 times your size. This wasn't a fight anymore. It wasn't even a battle. It was an execution. And the executioner was the American factory.
So what this all comes down to is that the war in the air, and maybe the war itself, was won on the factory floor. And the numbers that are about to follow, they're so huge they're almost hard to comprehend. This is the final industrial knockout punch.
96,270. That is how many military aircraft the United States built in one single year, 1944. Just remember FDR's impossible, laughable goal of 50,000. American workers didn't just meet it, they nearly doubled it.
And now,
Here's the number that just ends the entire discussion: 94,677. That is Germany's total aircraft production for the entire 6 years of the war combined. Let me say that again. The United States built more planes in 1944 than the Third Reich managed to build in its entire existence. That is the kind of math that doesn't just win battles, it ends civilizations.
And it all culminated on D-Day, June 6, 1944, as Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. If you looked up at the sky, the ratio of Allied aircraft to German aircraft was 36-1. That's not a tactical advantage, that's not air superiority. That is total, absolute industrial annihilation. The fate of the German soldiers on the ground that day was sealed, not by the men storming the beach in front of them, but by the women and men working in factories thousands and thousands of miles away.
So how does it all end? Well, to find out, we have to go right back to the beginning. We have to go back to the man whose laugh started this whole story. Because in the end, sitting in a prison cell at Nuremberg, Hermann Göring was finally forced to face the one reality he had mocked and denied for so long.
Before we hear from him, this right here really explains the why. This was never just about numbers. It was a battle between two completely different systems, two different ideas of how to run the world. America's strength came from a motivated, free, diverse workforce. Pilots in combat could send feedback directly to engineers on the factory floor, leading to constant, rapid improvements the system could learn. The Nazi system, on the other hand, came to rely on slave labor, forcing prisoners to work in secret underground tunnels. But slave labor is horribly inefficient. People have no reason to work hard and every reason to sabotage the product. Quality collapsed. And while American worker productivity skyrocketed by 300% during the war, German productivity actually went down. Their hateful ideology became their single greatest economic weakness.
And here it is, the final verdict, from the man himself. In his last letter, written just hours before he was supposed to be executed, Hermann Göring finally admits the truth. The very thing he laughed at, America's assembly lines, was the thing that destroyed him. People who were there said that in his cell, he would obsess over the Allied production numbers. He was fixated on what he called that damned factory, Willow Run, which he claimed broke our backs. There is no more powerful admission. The laughter that began in 1940 finally ended in 1946, not with a bang, but with a quiet, bitter confession.
So what do we take away from this incredible story? It leaves us with a really deep question. We saw a nation that looked totally unprepared transform into an unstoppable giant. It was proof that a free, democratic society, when united, could outproduce, out-innovate, and outlast a rigid, totalitarian one. Those B-24s rolling off the line every 63 minutes, they weren't just airplanes. They were arguments. They were democracy's answer to tyranny, a powerful testament to what free people can achieve when they work together. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it, when we face the great challenges of our own time, what incredible, untapped potential is still lying dormant inside our free societies today? What impossible goals are we capable of reaching if we just decide to?